What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you? The scariest thing that ever happened to me was only scary when I thought about it later. Recently, in a town over from us, a young man was reported as a missing person. He had just vanished from his residence 2 weeks prior to when he was reported missing. About a month later, they found his body, half a block from our house. They had found his body under a blue tarp. I walk pretty frequently in our neighborhood, and I walked past that tarp multiple times. Authorities say that the body was placed there, and I don't know what is scarier, knowing that a man's dead body was half a block away from where I was sleeping, or that his murderer was. Overdosing on a cocktail of stimulants while taking a shower. Fell to the bottom of the tub as time felt like it stopped completely. Felt like my consciousness was glitching much like a VHS tape on pause. I could see myself falling over and over in repeat for what seemed like hours. It's real difficult to describe the experience, but it was insanely terrifying. However, I was completely lucid simultaneously, and all I could think of was how regretful I was that I had caused my own death and how much I was going to miss my family. There was so much more I wanted to experience in life. I finally regained control of my body and crawled out of the tub covered in vomit. Spent the rest of the night on the bathroom floor sobbing in gratitude. Stay away from that shit, yo. Was walking on the sidewalk near a freeway overpass when I heard an enormous crash. A man, a 15-foot piece of guardrail, and a V8 motor came flying down from the freeway. I literally jumped out of the way as it landed on the spot I was just walking on. The guardrail made a huge gash in the sidewalk. I would have been squashed. The man was twisted in every direction. His body was ripped apart. Apparently, he hit the guardrail in his car with such force the motor was ripped from the motor mounts, and he flew through the windshield. It was right across from a fire station, but the guy was dead. I just walked away, but it's always been a terrible memory. I was cliff jumping and I slipped on wet rock and started to slide down toward the edge. As I was going off the edge, I pushed off with my hands as hard as I could and was able to clear the rocks below and land in the water. Got pulled out by a riptide, inhaled a load of water and blacked out sinking in the sea. Woke up on the beach to a lifeguard giving me CPR. I've been sucked out a fairway a few times. You have to look out for them before you go in strong waters. Too many clueless tourists nearly drowned due to poor water knowledge here in Australia. My harness came undone in the middle of a roller coaster at King's Dominion. This happened to me but at Disneyland. The first seatbelt check went fine as did the second. Then as soon as we were mid-air it popped off. Thank God my aunt sitting next to me saw. She clung onto me so hard that her fake nails cracked and I had the indentions of her hands on my body. After we got off the ride the attendant simply said, "Oh, there was a coin jammed in the belt, happens a lot." When I was a kid, I was mucking about with a friend of mine. We were stood on an old disused railway bridge which had one hell of a drop to the road below. We should not have been up there as there were no railings. But kids will be kids. My friend decided to scare me by pushing me, and then grabbing my coat pulling me back. But for that second, my center of gravity was over and I was going to fall had he not pulled on me. For that split second I knew I was going to die. I was very pissed off at him. I've posted this before, but it definitely was scary for me, and still unnerves me, even nearly 20 years later. My mom was in the hospital 50 miles away. I was 19. We were pretty sure this was it. I was home alone. My parents' house is big. It's off the beaten path on a small lagoon. My dad had been staying up at the hospital. That night, I went to bed about 1 a.m. I was playing on my laptop. My room was in a separate wing of the house. It can be sealed off with a single locking door. The door was shut but not locked. I have always been scared of the dark, so I had the lights in my wing on. So was the closet light. As I was messing around on Game FAQs, I saw the lights in my wing turn off. All of them. The band of light under the door went black. I hopped up in bed and stared at it. My bedroom door was unlocked and I was debating getting up to lock it when the shut door slammed. As in, it sounded like someone straight up kicked the bottom of the door with all their strength. I remember squeaking in shock. It took me about 6 seconds to be up on both feet with the blade about 4 paces back and just right of the door. I remember thinking if the door swung open, I could be on whoever it was almost instantly. I was also silently cursing that there was no light under the door anymore. No way to see the shadow of whoever was out there. Nothing happened. I was fighting off the fear of the situation and stupidly decided that going on offense was all that was left. I didn't have a phone in my room, and my Nokia was in another wing of the house charging. I threw the door open with my knife low and my left hand in a guarded position. There was no one there. I tossed the hallway light switch on. There was no one in my wing. There was no one in the house. The burglar alarm was still on. Confused, I turned on the main house lights and sealed the wing off, locking the door between the main house and my area. I went back to my room and just sat there with my laptop open. My bedroom door now had a slight bow in it. A couple hours passed with me warily laying in bed. Around 3 a.m., the lights under the door went dark. That left me terrified. My knife seemed pretty insignificant and my previous dumb courage had ran out. I scooted my bed, no easy task, against my bedroom door, grateful the door opened inward. It all felt so wrong. Like something was angry with me. I retreated to my closet and waited for the sun to come up. When the skylight in my room got bright, my courage returned and I moved the bed and exited my room. The wing door had been unlocked, which required a key from the other side. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs in the main house and realized my dad was home. I felt a little foolish as obviously he had been responsible for turning the lights off the second time. I led my greeting with, "Oh, so it was you who turned all the lights off." He looked at me and replied, "What? I got home about 10 minutes ago." I have zero clue what happened that night, but it never happened before that night or after. Whatever it was, it seemed to like the dark and wasn't a fan of doors. And it seemed to be in my wing of the house. My parents built the house and nothing untoward had ever taken place there. My bedroom door at my parents' house still has a bow in it to this day. This was almost 20 years ago. My mom is still alive, and for that, I'm extremely grateful. Not something that happened to me, but something I saw. We lived on the corner of the street, and the house across the street on our right was also a corner house. Well, one day, that house caught on fire because the lady living there decided it was a great idea to fall asleep with a candle on a wicker table next to curtains. It was really bad. We saw the lady jump out the second-story window and made it across the street. Well, she left her children in the house. One by one, they jumped out the second-story window. 3 tiny little children. My eldest brother ran across the street each time and brought them back. Once the firefighters put out the fire, they went inside the window to check out the house. The firefighter came out carrying a dead, burnt-up child. He had his arms up, as if he was pounding on a door. That was the most horrifying thing I have ever seen. When I was very young, I attended a pool party with my family. I watched one kid with such envy because he could backflip off the edge into the pool. I summoned the courage to try it without ever attempting it before. As I launched my body, I remember in mid-arc that time felt like it slowed down. Something told me to cock my head to one side. Just as I did, my shoulder slammed off the edge of the pool. I remember walking it off as if I was embarrassed, but that moment really fucked with me. Had I not tilted my head, it could have ended very differently. We didn't know we were being watched for months. The robbers or murderers hid under the big exterior staircase leading up to our house a few weeks before Christmas. They probably noticed, or they knew, that my dad was on his occasional travel and won't be home for weeks. My older brother was also out of town. It was just me, my mom, and my cousins. Some neighbors were driving home that time and passed by our property around 8 p.m. They immediately called us saying there were shadowy figures holding something shiny going under our staircase. I guess those creepy shadows knew that 2 of us would go down that staircase around 8:30 to 9 o'clock to take out the trash. My mom radioed security, but they only found a newly sharpened big butcher's knife with no handle. We don't own anything like that. Needless to say, we didn't get much sleep that night. Heck, they were already too familiar with our schedule and knew the perfect time to attack. We moved out years ago. But this incident still haunts me. A friend of mine was drinking and decided to pull out a revolver while we were sitting around talking, unloaded the gun, but in a drunk stupor decided to replace one bullet and play Russian roulette. While trying to take the gun from him, he points it toward the ground and says it's not loaded and pulls the trigger, hitting me in my left leg. Blood was everywhere, but luckily we was only 1 block from the hospital and I immediately rushed out and flew straight there. They believed I was going to lose from the knee down, but after a second opinion and a transfer to a better hospital, there was minimal damage after surgery and a couple months recovering. I retained 100% use of my leg, thank the Lord above. Never talked or hung out with him again. Never hang out with drunk idiots or idiots in general. Stupidity and guns don't mix. Riding a bike home from Walmart, getting hit by a truck, flying into a rock which fractured my skull and knocked out a piece of it, which apparently saved my life because my brain was swelling a lot. Man, that is rough. How are you now, like health-wise? I was in a medically induced coma for a month in which I thought I was Dr. Wily and told my mom I was going to take over the world with my army of robots. I'm fine now, though my vision is a bit wonky. A lot of my life is just gone from my memory, and I have questionable short-term memory. I nearly drowned thrice while learning to swim, the good old method of letting your child figure it out or die trying, which turns out doesn't work for me. I need a clear understanding of the why and how. I nearly drowned my first time down a water slide, and nobody noticed. I knew it was a bad idea to try that slide, since I could hardly doggy paddle. Got disoriented when I hit the deep water at the bottom of the slide and lost track of up. Started doing that ladder climbing motion trying to find up, but was going sideways into the shallower water. Crashed into something, climbed up it in total panic and calmed down after mostly getting out of the water. I was perched on my friend's shoulders and the water was shallow enough to stand in, so she thought it was hilarious. But I totally see how drowning people end up drowning other people. There is no room in that panic for identifying objects, it's all grab and climb. A robber got into my house when I was about 8. Luckily, my dog noticed and bit the guy's leg and wouldn't let go. My dad heard the commotion, ran downstairs to see the robber trying to go back over the fence, with my dog still attached to their leg. My dad had to pull my dog off this guy's leg because she wouldn't let go. Police were called, but the guy was long gone. Doggy is still alive to this day. We got robbed in the night, but just by some daft kids who were scared off when they heard my mom coming downstairs with my brother when he was a baby, luckily. My dog was found upstairs cowering under the bed. She was also scared of flies and Pavarotti. She was a lovely little coward. Knocked over a propane tank in the garage. Cracked the neck and it started off gassing. It was between me and the door into the house. Garage door was closed. Cleared the door about a half second before it ignited from the gas water heater's pilot light. Lost all the hair on my face and got a burn on the hand I used to pull myself through the door. House was a total loss, but we all got out okay. My abusive soon-to-be ex-husband took up blacksmithing a few years ago, despite us living in a small apartment. This involved keeping a hefty propane tank in our home, specifically in the living room between the bedrooms and the only exit. Have cats, but it was just sitting in the open. And he insisted on smoking his weed pipe with a torch while sitting right next to it. I do not know how that went on so long without tragedy. I begged and pleaded and reasoned, even said we really shouldn't blow up the neighbors, but Mr. Asshat could not be persuaded. When I finally escaped from him and explained what had been going on to the cops, they called it involuntary confinement or something like that. One of the first things I did when I got the apartment back was have a friend haul away that stupid propane tank. I had to run into an apartment fire last decade to save a friend, so I was very well aware how dangerous it was living in an overcrowded fire trap of a home with a propane tank between me and the kids and our only exit. There was a period of about a month when I was 15 when I was displaced from my house after a fire and partially unable to walk due to an angle grinder accident. I was living with my grandfather who was not home most days. One day I started seeing shadow people of varying heights and conditions in the corner of my eye and occasionally hearing things. Eventually these got more frequent and started being accompanied by nightmares. I kept getting worsening hallucinations until they started being near constant and appearing in my main, non-peripheral visual, and I could make out details, and the noises had developed into frequent whispering. I eventually called my father after I couldn't take it anymore and moved into a hotel. I didn't tell him about the hallucinations. They went away after that, and I haven't had them since. The other time I had any similar experience was the night my step-grandfather, if that's the term, the guy my grandmother on the other side of the family got remarried to, died when I was 5. I saw him standing in my room as an apparition when I was 5. I didn't learn about his death until the next night. That story isn't as terrifying as it is kinda sweet since we were always close, but it's still relevant. It was Snowpocalypse 2010 in DC, which dumped 17.8 inches of snow on a city that wasn't equipped to handle it. We didn't have to work, so I had gone out for the night, was in my early 20s, with friends. I was walking home, slightly inebriated, and went to cross the street. I had the right of way, and then, boom, I woke up on the ground or sidewalk with a bunch of people hovering over me. I started freaking out, thinking I drunkenly fell, and insisted on getting up and leaving the situation. The bystanders refused to let me get up and informed me that I'd slipped on a patch of ice and gotten clipped by a station wagon as I crossed the street. Although I felt no pain, I instantly thought that I was gonna die and called my parents hysterical as we waited for the ambulance to arrive. I ended up in Georgetown Hospital for 3 days and suffered a fractured nose, 2 chipped teeth, a broken arm, and my face looked like I'd been literally mauled. They never found the station wagon or driver who hit me. Thankful to the bystanders who stayed with me that night. It was just before Valentine's Day, and one even brought me balloons in the hospital one day. My first year at a small but well-known college for the arts. Think of the movie Fame. There's always someone singing or playing music, laughing, talking, etc. I walk out of the bathroom and no one is in the hallway. Not a single sound on the entire floor. I walk around the hallway for a bit and can't find anyone. Cell phone service is shit inside the building and I have no signal. Eventually, I take a look at our electronic notice board to see a bright red screen with big black letters, active shooter in building. I froze. I had never done an active shooter drill before and didn't know what to do. A lot of the doors automatically lock and I wasn't able to enter any of the rooms to hide. I wasn't sure if I could make it to the stairwell to escape the building, and I wasn't sure where anyone was, including this shooter. I ended up stuffing myself in an open locker and held my breath for what felt like hours. It turns out the security team at school made a big mistake and shared the active shooter warning by accident. There was no shooter and it wasn't even a drill, just a complete mistake. Thinking about it now makes me worry what I would do in a similar situation, as mass shootings happen often in the US. I'm just grateful it was a mistake and not real. This is going to be long, and it's probably going to be buried, but it feels good to write about. When I was 10, I lived in a very small town, 1,200 people, and I lived 15 minutes from town in the woods. My dad and I were watching his friend's house, which was about 3 to 4 miles from our own, and just so happened to live closer to my friend's house. So one day after school, I begged my dad to let me walk to my friend's house, and eventually he let me. There's not much in between the houses, and she lived about a half a mile away. At almost the halfway mark, this guy pulls up and asks me where a road was. I knew not to talk to strangers, so I just pointed behind me as I kept walking. He then started asking me questions like where I lived, why I was walking in the rain, it was barely drizzling, and I had a raincoat on. He then stops his car and says, "I can't let you walk in this, let me take you home." Now, deer in headlights is real, and I completely froze. I wish I could say I ran, that I fought, but I was basically a mannequin, kinda like an ostrich with its head in the sand, but my neck wasn't that long, and it was just mud. He asked where I lived and kept missing the turn. We drove past a restaurant and I lied and said my aunt was working and he could drop me off there. He said he would, but when he didn't, that's the exact moment I realized I was in trouble. I'm not going to get into detail because it's not required, but I'll just say that he took me deep into the woods, and on the way there I kept trying to figure out what he wanted from me. I thought about every situation, from trying to get money from my family to making me a slave, but what he did to me I somehow didn't expect. It was like I thought that stuff didn't happen, I had never heard of it before. And that night I lost a lot of innocence. 16 hours later he tried to strangle me to death, but I kept kicking his window, and apparently he would rather have a window than kill me. He told me to turn the opposite way and start walking. He told me earlier that he had a gun and I thought he was going to shoot me in the back of the head, but he just drove off. Luckily, I knew where I was. Generally speaking, my bus went past where we were every morning. Yes, it sucked having to see it every day, so I walked to the nearest house that I knew had kids. It was about 5 miles away, and every time a car would get close I would run and hide in the woods just in case it was him to come back and finish me off. A few times I didn't make it, and every single one of them would stop and ask if I was one of the kids who ran away. Yep, I guess some kids ran away and people were out looking for them. That made me feel real shitty. I thought no one was looking for me. But I always shook my head and lied and pointed to a random house and said I lived there. I don't know how long it took me, but I eventually made it to the house with the kids and knocked on their door. I was probably another 5 miles from where my dad was. I remember when the mom answered the door and I blurted out what happened to me and asked to use her phone. She kept asking me what I said because she couldn't comprehend it. I get it, LOL. So I gave up trying and asked if I could use her phone. I tried my dad, busy, my grandma, busy, uncle, also busy. I remember thinking, man, they must all be talking with each other and planning out a fun day that I'm going to miss out on. I didn't know what to do and I started crying. The lady said she could give me a ride home and I agreed. I remember getting close to the house and seeing a ton of cars, some were cop cars, lights and all. I remember thinking, this is why everyone was on the phone. They were finally organizing a parade down our road. I never got to experience many parades and secretly wanted one on my road. Everyone was backed up, and what I didn't know then was that they were searching every car. Then I saw my dad, and I practically yelled, "That's my dad." And I guess he heard me yelling, looked right at me, and said, "She's here." And I jumped out of the lady's truck and went to run for him, but the police grabbed me and threw me into the back of their car. I just wanted to go home. The rest of the day is a blur. I don't remember much, and the only reason I remember what I do, yes, every little detail, is because for over a year afterwards, once every couple of weeks, I was forced to retell what happened to me up until that point in a courtroom so my memory would stay fresh until he was caught. Besides the act, the hardest part was that everyone in town knew, so in a fucked up way, I was a celebrity. I couldn't ride the bus in peace because the radio would mention what happened to me and everyone would stare at me. Kids called me a whore, there were rumors that I was pregnant, that I asked for it, etc. One girl acted like my friend for months just to get me to talk about what happened, then she stopped being my friend and lied to her other friends about what happened to me. It took me years to trust anyone again, and I was terrified of everyone. I remember my dad took me to the store and I stayed in the car while he went in. A man pulled up next to us and I was already scared, but then he came up to the car and said, "You're Gallifrey, aren't you?" I was so incredibly scared. I had no idea who he was, but then he introduced himself as Sarah's boyfriend, a woman my dad used to date, but that made no difference to me. He was a stranger and a man. I started to panic, but looking at me you wouldn't tell unless you got close as there were tears in my eyes, and I had peed a little. I was slowly rolling up my window and locked the door. The guy kept talking, about what? No idea, I could only hear waves. He eventually said goodbye and walked into the store. My dad came out and saw how freaked out I was and wanted to go fight the guy, but it wasn't his fault and I begged my dad not to. Years later I saw Sarah, not really her name, and she immediately apologized to me. She said that her boyfriend didn't know what had just happened to me and feels terrible for scaring me. Apparently he did notice. The guy who kidnapped me was caught a little over a year later and he's in prison for life. Sometimes I think, what if he did succeed in killing me and this life with terrorist attacks, COVID, Nazis in the streets, is just the nightmare before actual death? You wouldn't be able to find any of this online because it happened before the internet and in a small town no one cares about. Sometimes I feel like I would like to write to him and maybe forgive him, but I haven't fully yet, maybe eventually. Anyways, this novel is done, LOL. That was the scariest thing to ever happen to me. Which story was your favorite? Let me know in the comments. Leave a like and subscribe.